Welcome. Today is a fairly short lesson. We're going to cover Amendments 16 and 17. They're just practical amendments that hopefully make life better or at least different for Americans today than they were before the amendments. So let's start with Amendment 16. So, Amendment 16 simply says that Congress shall have power to lay and collect taxes on incomes from whatever source derived without apportionment among the several states and without regard to any census or enumeration. Of course, none of us likes paying our federal income taxes. So, when we see this amendment, we tend to go ooh. But when you get the backstory on it, it makes a little more sense. So let's talk about that. All right. So this amendment changed Article 1, Section 9 of the Constitution that said that Congress had the power to lay taxes in a proportional way. All right. So what that meant was that there was apportionment to fund the federal government, and also there were tariffs to fund the federal government. All right, and so before this amendment, there had been an income tax during the Civil War, but it only lasted a short time, and it was there to fund the war. Then what happened then is the government went back to, after the Civil War, to that Article 1, Section 9 that had the government fund itself by portioning the bill out. You know, they have a federal budget, and they would divide a lot of that budget proportionally by population to each state. So if you were in a really populous state, your tax bill as a state would be based on your larger population, and it would be a bigger bill than a state that had a lower population. This was not at all concerned about how wealthy the state was. So if it was a wealthy populace, they still paid the same proportion as a poorer state. It was the proportion was by number of people, not by amount of money. So people who lived in states that were not as wealthy as other states felt like this was an unfair burden on them in funding the government. Like they're proportionally giving the federal government more money compared to wealthier states who were getting a better deal in the process. All right, so also one of the big ways to fund the government at that time was through tariffs. And so things that are imported into the United States from other countries would pay a tariff. So the countries, organizations, whoever was bringing a product into the United States would pay a tariff or a tax on that good that they were bringing into the country. All right, so of course, they're not going to say, oh, I'm just giving this money up. They just charge more to the American companies that bought that merchandise and then sold it to the American consumers. And the American consumers then pay higher prices. What happened is that by the end of the Gilded Age, so you're thinking like the late 1800s, people were paying a pretty high percentage of their income on tariffs because they had things they had to buy, like farmers had to buy farm equipment. Homemakers had to buy a kettle to cook their supper in. No matter how poor they were, every American had a thing they had to buy at times, and they were paying the tariff for that essentially. So they were being taxed, and they were being taxed at the same rate as the very, very wealthy people who, there's a larger, highly wealthy class during the late 1800s, that Gilded Age period, because of the big factories and big corporations that were able to get very, very wealthy during this time, because they were paying their workers very, very poorly. As there was not much labor protection in those days and not many labor laws. And so they were very wealthy. They didn't notice and they didn't care if they were buying merchandise with a tariff added onto it, because they had so much money. It wasn't causing them pain. So between the states having a higher proportion, if they were not a wealthy state, of their taxes that they had to pay to the federal government, and the tariffs being a burden on the lower classes and the working classes, there became this big uprising to change the structure of how the federal government funded a lot of itself. So to do away from apportionment, that state part of the bill, and away from tariffs, and instead on a graduated income tax. So the Congress tried a 2% income tax across the board in 1894, where everybody who made more than $4,000 in a year would pay this 2%. However, some people did not like that, because it also taxed business income. So not just the income from labor, but the income from businesses making money. And so in a Supreme Court case called Pollock versus Farmers Loan and Trust, the Supreme Court looked at the current, at that time, Article 1, Section 9 of the Constitution, that talked about direct taxes and proportionment and all that. And they said, really, you can't tax a business income. You can't tax income on income, because that is a direct tax that is not appropriately proportionate to the population. It's proportionate to a business, not to the population. And so, the people, the Americans who were carrying a heavier tax burden, go, hey, wait a minute, that is not fair. So these very, very wealthy businesses didn't have to pay taxes because they weren't people. And so they everybody's uprised about that. And so there was pressure on Congress. And by 1909, they proposed then an income tax that could be graduated the way the wording is. And I am not a tax lawyer, and I cannot tell you why this amendment allows that graduated income tax. And so also that integrated in it, businesses could be taxed as well. But it was wildly popular with the American populace. And so the 1909 amendment goes to the states. The states are happy because it's going to get rid of apportionment. So it makes it through the states. And by the presidential campaign of 1912, there was so much pressure for this income tax that all three presidential candidates, Teddy Roosevelt, William Taft, and Woodrow Wilson, all of them were in favor of this income tax. So it was ratified in 1913. And so you see, with the history of it, is that this income tax theoretically is much more fair to the average American, the one that is not wealthy, the one that doesn't have huge business income, but they are just earning a day-to-day living. So that was the purpose of the income tax, is to give the working class and the poorer people a fair shake compared to the wealthy corporate bigwigs. All right, now let's look at Amendment 17. All right, so Amendment 17 changes how senators are elected. So let me read that one to you. All right, so in Article 1, Section 3, before we get started, we had the selection of senators that was different than what we have now. So it said that the Senate of the United States would be composed of 2 senators from each state. That was elected by the state legislature. So there's appointed by the state legislators and not elected by the people by popular vote. The problem with that is that sometimes in those days, and maybe sometimes these days, the state legislatures can be kind of like a good old boys club. And, so they're getting their best buddies that they choose to be senators. And sometimes that was great. And sometimes it was just the corrupt millionaire who had more money to give to his buddies, under the table, or take them on a fabulous vacation. And so it turned out that the American people were feeling like the Senate had become this hotbed of cronyism and sometimes corruption, because the state legislatures were choosing their buds to be the senators. And so what then we got is this uprising to change the election of senators to be by the people, so the people had a voice. So Amendment 17 says, the Senate of the United States shall be composed of 2 senators from each state, elected by the people thereof for 6 years, and each senator shall have 1 vote. The electors in each state shall have the qualifications requisite for electors of the most numerous branch of the state legislatures. All right. Now, so this amendment was there to change the election process. So now senators are elected by popular vote. This amendment was so popular that 29 states were already doing this. They had changed their state constitutions for electing their senators by the people. So it was quickly ratified when it was proposed. So that's how we get our senators now, is by popular vote. Interestingly, it also addressed a problem with vacancies. And the problem is, in those days, they would have to do the whole process over again, and the state legislatures would have to, appoint another senator, and sometimes that could go on and on for a long time. So now the state legislature can tell the governor, you go ahead and appoint a temporary one until there can be an election. Okay, now we just got to take a minute and tell a funny story. One thing that made this such a useful amendment for the Constitution is sometimes state legislatures, when they were voting, they couldn't choose somebody, so that sometimes they would get deadlocked and not be able to come up with a clear winner in that state legislature appointed kind of thing. So one time, the state of Delaware, so this is little Delaware, in 1895 had a deadlock 3 ways. So there were 3 people who were on the ballot in the state legislature for them to choose as senator, and they kept voting over and over and over again. It took 144 ballots and 2 years for them to finally choose a senator. So Delaware essentially was without senators for 2 years. And so this was a problem. So hopefully this Amendment 17 would take care of that problem. So I just see that the graphic here was from when we were reading through the Constitution of the month. So that was day 22. All right. So, and now we're working through the whole Constitution in a more deep dive. Well, that takes care of Amendments 16 and 17. So we can see the practical things, like people wanted more fairness. They wanted the wealthy to pay their share. They wanted corporations to pay their share. And they wanted a voice in choosing their senators and not get stuck in deadlocks for 2 years in the state legislature. So more voice for the people. And that's our Constitution, and that's our nation. All right, we will go on to the next amendments in our next session. Thanks for being with